Well, Hans, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and especially because Europe is facing one of the bigger energy crises. In the past few days, we have the electrical outages in almost the whole of Spain and Portugal. So you picked the timing well to record this. So congratulations. Was Aurora behind this?
Oh yes, clearly it was us who rigged it to ensure that there's enough interest in the power sector, and we get lots of questions. But no, seriously, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. I mean, I had obviously a chance to speak with like Wolfgang Münchau and from the FT and the Unheard, but then obviously have one of the 40 under 40 in Germany, and obviously who happens to be also my friend from Warwick in Oxford. So and a great person to speak about energy in Europe. So Hans, if actually, I mean, maybe it makes sense to start, given what's going on in Spain and Portugal. I don't want to obviously, spread unsubstantiated rumors, which some people point to it being sort of partly due to the actual success of the renewables in both markets. The official account by now is that it is due to an atmospheric change. But I mean, I don't want you to speculate on this, but in general, I think there seems to be a very strong anti-renewables push in Europe. Obviously, also coming from Trump's re-election in the States. So what do you think is the sort of the attitudes towards the renewables? Do you think we've been overpromised or underpromised?
Um, okay, that's a lot. That's a very big question. So maybe let's start with the Spanish situation, and then
Okay.
see how we can kind of zoom out to the bigger picture in Europe. And I think one question is when this airs. So our listeners may very well actually know more about it than we do right now. So just for the record, we are recording this in the morning of the 29th of April, and so far there's actually not a lot of detail that has been has been published yet. What we do know is that it's been a very wide-ranging power cut, blackout, which has affected most of the country, which is extremely unusual. Like these things in Europe, they happen kind of at the frequency of decades rather than years or weeks or months or something like that. This is something highly unusual. What we also know, or what the system operators in Spain and Portugal have said, that indeed it has to do with some kind of atmospheric interactions between the grid and well, the environment. And I'm not going to get into the details here because I can't, because I'm not a physicist or an electrical engineer.
I mean, we both did PP, which obviously
Exactly.
qualifies as both.
We're both kind of liberal arts hand wavers rather than the hard scientists or engineers. But they have pointed in that direction, but that is not something which should normally cause a blackout. And why it did, I think, will be something that will be for investigation in the next couple of days and weeks. One potential contribution, one potential reason why it led to the blackout could be that there was relatively little conventional power plants on the grid in Spain at the time, because basically the conventional power plants they have basically very big spinning masses, the generators, which are synchronized to the grid, and they provide something to the grid called inertia. So basically, when there's a little shock to the grid, just through having this big spinning mass on the grid, the grid will have a tendency to return to its normal state. And when you have fewer of these power plants, the grid can be more vulnerable to these kind of things. So that is one potential contributing factor. Whether it has and what kind of role it plays, whether there have been other contributing factors, it's really too early to tell. So we'll have to watch the news. What is actually quite remarkable though is how quickly they managed to bring it back. So as of this morning, practically the entire country is back online, which kind of as a recovery from such a far-reaching and wide-ranging blackout is really a quite impressive achievement from the grid operator. So kudos on that. On the wider question of the kind of the status of renewables in Europe, I would say the glass is half full and half empty. Arguably, even in the United States, because of course Trump has gone round and said, oh, he doesn't like these windmills and
They're bad for the whales.
Exactly, offshore, but also onshore, and he wants to bring back. Well, his first thing was about bringing back coal in his first term, which didn't happen. Right, there was no resurgence in coal in the U.S., and that was for economic reasons. And now his second term, his communications has been much more about oil and gas, and we want this resurgence of American oil and gas. But at the same time, he wants low oil prices and low gas prices, right? And that is that to some extent is a contradiction, because even now we're hearing from the American oil and gas producers that at the current market prices, it's not going to be profitable for them to make big investments to expand production. So we'll have to see whether he actually succeeds in expanding production there significantly. And at the same time, if you look at the renewable side, yes, he's cancelled a bunch of offshore wind projects, which I don't think is a good thing. Generally speaking, I mean these have been projects which have been driven for years, mostly at the state level. Actually, they would have provided clean electricity at competitive prices for the citizens, especially on the American East Coast. So that's not a good thing. But if you look at onshore wind and solar and battery storage in particular, there actually hasn't been much of a movement against that from the central government so far, and the dynamic, I think, is very much intact. Why is that? And I think a lot of it is actually has to do with fundamentals, because there's a lot of demand growth, electricity demand growth in the US through, of course, on the one hand, more air conditioning, these kind of things, but especially, of course, data centers and AI. And when the big data center companies, the hyperscalers, Google, Meta, and so forth, but also smaller operators, when they are thinking about where they're getting their electricity, they're looking at cost. They're looking at the lead time you need to get the electricity, and yes, a lot of them also have sustainability standards. And if you look at all three of these things, onshore wind, solar, firmed with batteries, is actually a pretty attractive package, because it's something that in lots of places around the world, renewables are now competitive with conventional sources of electricity. You can realize these projects within a year, 2 or 3, which is actually very different to building a new massive coal or gas power station, where you're really talking about 5 years plus to get everything permitted and then built, and it meets the sustainability criteria of these data center operators. So even in the US, we continue to see a lot of momentum behind onshore wind, solar, batteries, and that is pretty much the same thing in Europe. In Europe, you actually get you have an additional dimension there, which has to do with a certain degree of autonomy, because in a way, we had the energy crisis over the past couple of years, and where we found out the hard way that getting half of one's gas from a single supplier exposes oneself to pressure if your relations with that supplier suddenly deteriorate, right? To phrase this very
Diplomatically.
neutrally, and we've diversified very heavily towards American LNG in particular, and under the new political circumstances, I think it's a valid question to ask, is whether we can still trust American LNG, or whether we can't conceive of a world where the American president bans LNG shipments to Europe because we do something he doesn't like, right? And there, Europe is not. Most parts of Europe is not naturally rich in fossil fuels, and their renewables provide a way to reduce that import dependency on fossil energy. So that argument for renewables has probably gained in strength over the past half year or so.
Yeah, and obviously very, very understandably, given what is going on, especially now that even there seems to be, right, well, I mean, that's also speculation, but the chance of the US and Russia basically agreeing to also control that part, jointly sort of affect that part of energy supply to Europe, which even if there is peace, will put Europe in a very strange situation of almost complete reliance on the US.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's the discussions around control of the Ukrainian pipeline systems by the US, and then a couple of weeks ago there were also some very interesting rumors about American investors buying the Nord Stream pipelines through the Baltic Sea, or what's left of them, and fixing them up. And I mean, we live in very interesting times. I think the Nord Stream thing that I would find very surprising, because in a way, bringing them back online, and well, there's one pipeline of the four still intact, but that's part of Nord Stream 2, which actually hasn't been fully permitted, and that requires the collaboration of a lot of or the agreement of a lot of member states along the Baltic coast, many of whom aren't particularly big fans of Russia. So I think Nord Stream being brought back online would be a big surprise to me. The Ukrainian transit coming back in some form, whether that is through a direct deal between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, or with the involvement of the Americans, that I would almost expect to be part of some form of settlement of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, but maybe we still continue a bit on the renewables, given that I don't know. I was always sort of a skeptic because I'm just I don't know, it's like being contrarian, I guess. But I think maybe one of the problems, even if it turns out what's going on with in the Iberian Peninsula is to an extent due to over reliance on renewables. Isn't that sort of part of any sort of technological development that, in a sense, kind of when, we first got gas in households, things blew up very regularly, and sort of, through several decades of refinements, things actually start working. And I think maybe the problem with renewables is that they were sort of sold a bit as sort of a panacea, as a lot of new technology is, without the usual caveats that, okay, I mean, it will marginally help, or rather help on the margin, but that, it's not a sort of a perfect thing. And yeah, and do you think there's a shift in sort of public perception of the renewables, or because especially in Germany, which is a big proponent?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think on renewables, the challenge is when you get to very high penetrations in the system, building getting to 10, getting to 20, getting to 30% penetration of intermittent renewables in an electricity system isn't a problem from a system perspective. But as you drive that towards 60, 70, 80%, they more and more start to drive the system, that from a technical perspective, that is something that can be solved. Again, I'm not an engineer, but the engineers tell me
Will
that
solve it.
we've got all the tools to actually run a system even at very, very high renewables shares. The problem is that we need to actually we need to take care of these things, of building these things. So one example. So I was saying earlier that when you have a lot of you have the sun is shining, you have the wind blowing, you don't have a lot of conventional thermal generators on the system. You have fewer rotating masses, you have less inertia, what it's called. There are other ways of making inertia rather than through conventional power plants. You can actually spin up big wheels and just kind of like have them running synchronized with the system. You can do things. It's called synthetic inertia with a battery. Actually, batteries are lithium-ion batteries are very fast to respond, and you can basically get them to respond to these very small ticks in kind of demand and supply to balance the system. So there are solutions to that, but you need to procure them, and that is again, I think it's too early to tell whether that is the explanation of the Spanish situation. But if it is,
In theory,
I would expect the network operators there to put a bigger focus on that, and that is something to bring it back to Germany. The German network operators already started a process for procuring inertia, actually, for exactly to provide this additional guarantee when there's a lot of wind and sun. But I think the wider problem or the wider point is a good one, because yes, you do start to face these issues once you get to very high renewable penetration rates. You also face more grid bottlenecks. You face a question of how you actually refinance the backup capacities, because the thermal power plants that are running when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, they are getting fewer and fewer running hours, so they might have a problem to remain profitable. So there's all kinds of things that you need to think about and solve when you get to high shares. I would argue that there are solutions to all these problems, but they require conscious effort and policy making and new regulation. You can't simply expect to continue with the system you had in the fossil days and build lots of renewables, and for that to for that to keep working. Yes.
Yeah. And coming back to the question of perception of the renewables and this energy policy, which is obviously a big thing in Germany, especially in Germany, given that Greens are a major political force, but they're now out of government. Is that changing somewhat?
No, not really, I would say. So looking at the political mainstream, and also looking at the coalition agreement, which are very likely, I mean, they're not in office yet, but are very likely new government just agreed on a couple of weeks ago. It's a lot of it is basically business as usual, and remaining along in the same general direction, while making some adjustments along the way. And so one of the things the new government wants to do differently, for instance, is that they want to synchronize building the renewables and building the grids more strongly. that in itself, I think, is a good thing, right? And we shouldn't be building renewables in locations where we can't get the electricity away, right? And where we have to curtail the plants 50% of the time. That's not a very good use of resources. So that is that is one thing for instance. The other thing the new government will likely do is that they reduce the build out targets somewhat, because the current build out targets for renewables, they are geared towards a much higher electricity consumption in the medium term, which we will likely have. So basically, the current or the previous government, they had assumed that Germany would have an electricity demand of 750 terawatt hours in 2030. So that's 5 years away. Right now, we're a bit above 500. Right, so that's almost 50% electricity demand growth in 5 years, which I think it's fair to say is highly unlikely to happen, even with data centers and electric vehicles and so forth. So what the new government is likely to do is they're going to scale back on the targets, but only on the absolute targets, not on the relative targets of what percentage of renewables you would want in the mix. Because essentially electricity demand is growing more slowly than previously thought. So summing up, I don't think there's a general move away from renewables in the German mainstream. During the election campaign, there was quite some talk about the return of nuclear. That has been a talking point on the conservative side. Just for our listeners who don't follow German energy policy very closely, Germany switched off its last three nuclear reactors 2 years ago, and has been kind of taking them or dismantling them ever since. One of the election campaign points of the conservative has been, okay, we should stop this dismantling process and we should rather talk about how we can bring them back. That to me always sounded like a political talking point towards a small but very
committed group,
constituency that was in favor of this, but I don't think that ever was realistic, because the operators of these plants, they have been very clear that they don't consider it desirable or even feasible to do this over a short time frame. Really, we're talking about at least 5 years to bring these plants back online. Billions of investments and so forth. And on the side of the operators, there was no interest in this, and that's why the claim, as I had expected, was also dropped very quietly after the elections.
Yeah, and I think actually one thing that actually, I mean, is an important context that I realized after listening to Wolfgang Münchau, is that actually there was an idea to basically get rid of nuclear by 2030 anyway. That has been sort of a long-standing plan, if I'm correct. And this was just sort of pushed back several years.
The German nuclear the German nuclear phase out, I mean, it's been a very long-standing policy. Yes. So this is not something, I think that's also important to bear in mind. That's not something which the
Greens
last
just
government
decided, yeah.
It just decided, but rather it's been actually it was initially negotiated between the operators and the Social Democrat Green government around 2000. I would have to look up the exact date, but I think it's 2000, 2001, something like that. There was then, and that was meant to be the last power plant would have switched down in around, I think, 2022, 2023. So over a 20-year time horizon, there was this this gradual phase out of nuclear. This was then, the timeline was then extended in Angela Merkel's second government, where she governed with the Liberals. But then Merkel went back on that only a year after because the Fukushima nuclear incident happened, and German popular opinion swung very strongly against nuclear, and so she basically went to more or less the same closure point as was previously agreed. So that's the history of it all. My personal take on this is that from an emissions, but also from a cost perspective, that it wasn't a very good idea to turn off these reactors. They have been some of the most reliable reactors in the world. If you look at the statistics, very few incidents, very good availability, and so forth. The argument, of course, is always but what about the storage of the nuclear nuclear waste? And there, the honest answer has to be, at least from an economist perspective, we have that problem anyway, right? Like we've already generated a lot of nuclear waste, and we need to find a place for it. Whether we have a little bit more or a little bit less is probably not going to tip the needle massively. And actually, that wasn't the case 20 years ago, but now there's some very interesting technologies being developed, like transmutation, for instance, which is actually taking the nuclear waste and turning them into something useful, which you can use in other sectors, for instance, in the medical sector. So there are things you could do with this waste. So. My take on this is that from an emissions, from a cost perspective, no, that wasn't a great policy. But really, you need to look at the politics, because it's been one of the most contentious, basically topics, really dividing the country almost half and half for several decades. The Green Party wasn't. In Germany, didn't come about as an anti-climate change or as a climate action party, but rather came about as an anti-nuclear party. And later, kind of when climate change became a topic, it wasn't a big topic in the 80s. Then that was kind of added. So it's been one of the main fault lines in German politics for decades. And through the phase out, this was somewhat pacified. I think that's the way to understand it, not from an economic perspective, where frankly I don't think it made much sense.
Yeah. And especially given that sort of in the times of Schröder in the beginning of 2000s, there was a big sort of move towards Russia, which back then seemed to be fully on board with the sort of liberal order, and sort of turning Germany's huge industry onto sort of Russian gas, which, ideally would run in perpetuity in a very nice and peaceful Europe.
It's actually quite quite interesting, because yes, that was then amplified in the 2000s, but actually the German or the European, but initially the German gas relationship with Russia actually goes back to basically the height of the Cold War. And if I can plug a book here,
Please.
There's a very interesting one called "The Bridge: Natural Gas in a Redivided Europe" by a guy called Thane Gustafson, and that's really, if listeners are interested in how basically the gas relationship between Europe and Russia came about, I would highly recommend that.
Yeah, and given that Serbia is Germany is one of our largest trading partners. We get a lot of FDI from Germany, so the questions of German industry are very important for us. And Münchau's book, another one probably that's worth reading, Kaput, does not seem to, as the title says, obviously, it does not seem to be super, bullish on Germany's industry. Do you sort of think his declinist vision that Germany is overregulated, over-reliant on old industries is sort of broadly true, or do you see a bit more of a silver lining?
Mm. So, to my great shame, I have to admit I haven't read Wolfgang's book yet, but it's on my list. So I
It's
can't
on
comment
every
exactly.
airport, Hans. It's every airport, and it's in the
It is. So yeah, I should definitely read it because I mean, obviously, highly respect him as an expert. So I think a lot of the issues are real, and a lot of the issues are very fundamental. In Germany, the debate is it has been a lot about, oh, it's been the bloody Greens energy policy which has made
destroyed everything.
our energy so expensive, and that's the whole and that's the whole issue of the German economy. And I think that's I'm not saying, by the way, that Wolfgang is making this argument, but that's been that's been kind of the populist take. And I think that is overly simplistic in the sense that Europe and also Germany has always been a relatively high energy cost location, right? And American in particular, gas prices were always cheaper than in Europe. It's just that through shale gas initially, but then also, of course, the drop in Russian supplies, this gap has widened, and that has been an issue for energy intensive industry, like basic chemicals, metals, and so forth in particular. I don't think, though, it's at the core of most of the German economic malaise, because most of kind of where German economic strength used to come from is from manufacturing, it's from machinery, tooling, and of course the car industry. And these things, they're not very energy intensive. If you look at if you look at energy as a kind of percentage of the total cost of a car, it's minuscule, right? So if we sell the right cars, especially the premium cars, which Germany used to be good at selling, you can afford to pay higher energy prices than others in the world. So I don't think that goes to the core of the issue. I think the issue is much rather related to, on the one hand, the transition to electric vehicles, where the German manufacturers have been very slow, for the most part, quite unambitious, and they've basically, I mean, it's the classic innovators or innovators dilemma, right? If you have quite a profitable existing business model, you will struggle to disrupt yourself with the new thing that's coming, and I think that's a textbook case of that. The second thing we're seeing is that the exports of machinery and of kind of industrial equipment, which kind of really plays a big role in Germany there. China in particular has become incredibly competitive, and they've learned a lot. They probably also took some of the into intellectual property there, but actually German companies gave it to them quite willingly, right? Because a lot of them, to access the Chinese market, they were producing there, and of course there's then a transfer of
Technology.
know-how. And not only does China import less from Germany now, but they started exporting and serving the world market with a lot of this industrial equipment themselves. So I think that's the second issue. And the third is that there are a lot of sectors actually that are doing quite well in Europe. There are highly successful in Europe and Germany in particular. There are highly successful startups, scale-ups, even SMEs in sectors which are growing fast, but they are then struggling to find funding and also talent, because the labor market in particular is far too rigid. So political focus has been very strongly on keeping workers employed in their existing, in inverted commas, old economy jobs through subsidies, through through regulation, through now tariffs and so forth, rather than enabling this transition from low productivity jobs, which probably don't have a future in Germany without subsidies, into more productive sectors, and that's something the US with its less regulated labor market is simply much better at, and that's. I'm not saying, by the way, we should be getting rid of all labor market protections. I think Europe has something worth protecting there as well, but we shouldn't artificially, through state action, seek to hold up this transition and basically keep and subsidize low productivity industry at the cost of redeploying human capital, but also physical capital in more productive sectors. But I think that's exactly what's happening in Europe right now.
Yes, yes. And I mean, one thing that you mentioned was obviously also just financial capital, which then the capital markets in Europe outside of Britain are just not as sort of proactive in fostering sort of the new economy, so to speak.
Exactly, and that's really you really find that when you look at later stage startups. So typically, and this is all anecdotal, but yeah, I've lots of friends here from the startup bubble in Berlin, and what you see is that for their seed rounds or even their Series A. A lot of startups will have a German or European investors, and there's not a big funding problem at that stage. But when you're talking about Series B, Series C, and so forth, so where the tickets are then in the tens or hundreds of millions. The deep pockets, they're all in the US, and that's where practically all of these startups go to American investors rather than European, rather than finding European funders, and that is kind of the valley of death from a European VC perspective, rather than in the early stage. Like you can do a perfectly fine seed round or Series A with European investors.
Yeah, and then obviously you also have the US as a very homogeneous, relatively underregulated market where it's easy to scale up as opposed to whatever, 20, 30 countries, different legal frameworks and everything. So
yeah. Of course, that comes on top of it. Yeah, it's not just a funding thing. It's also simplicity of scaling thing.
yeah. But I mean, given that you are in Berlin and sort of in touch with all these brilliant, cool people, some of whom I had a chance meeting. Sort of, what do you see as the sort of future for Europe? Obviously, it's very, it's very weird times. There might actually be peace between Russia and Ukraine in the coming months. Things might normalize or whatever that means somewhat, but still there are major challenges. So obviously, we'll take all of this with a grain of salt. But how do you see things sort of progressing with the new German government and
Mm. Well, I'm going to make the bear case, and I'm going to make the bull case, and I think our listeners can decide themselves which is the more credible one. But because frankly, I think uncertainty is massive right now, and I think both are actually quite plausible in a way. And of course, that's not necessarily a great place to be. So the bear case is that Germany's government does not find the political strength to address some of the fundamental issues with the German business and political model, which we've discussed just now. there's a strengthening of the political fringes, especially the right wing. Over the next couple of years, then well, the government potentially falls apart, or they kind of manage to cling together for a full 4-year term. But then we, in some way, have a government with the involvement of the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. And kind of that leads to an erosion of democratic standards. In some of the federal states in East Germany, we probably have AfD involved, or at least tolerated governments even before then. The security situation deteriorates in Europe because the settlement between Ukraine and Russia turns out not to be stable. There's another Russian attack in a couple of years' time, but this time the action is also taken to the Baltics. The question Germany will then have to ask themselves: okay, do we get involved there? Do we honor our commitments under the EU and NATO mutual defense clauses or not? And that's all a big mess. So that's the bear case, and unfortunately, I think it's a very plausible scenario. The bull case has actually been I think made very well by in The Economist a couple, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they had it was a pretty short piece where they basically said, well, I think it was a Charlemagne column actually. Suddenly Europe doesn't look so bad because actually half a year ago everyone was talking about the decline of Europe, but and everything is slow here, everything is a bit overregulated, but at least we generally speaking have reliable rule of law. We don't tend to expropriate in investors. We don't tend to arrest judges. We don't tend to have campaigns against our universities, as is happening in the US right now. So the relative boring normality of Europe in a world where kind of things in the US do seem to be spiraling a bit out of control. Independence of the central bank is probably another one. Is, despite all the fundamental issues that Europe has, is a relative strength. And one of the things the new German government wants to do now, for instance, is free up funds and also create new funds to poach top academics from the US who no longer feel comfortable or safe or welcome or whatever, and try to get them to European universities. And that's, I mean, if you told me about that this is a conversation we'd be having a couple of years ago, I would have probably said you're nuts. But that's there is an opportunity in the relative boringness and normality of Europe and of Germany there, which, if we play our cards well, which could actually lead to quite a good couple of years.
Yeah. And just economically, in the second scenario, how would you sort of help maintain Europe? I guess obviously academics, we know, are huge net contributors, especially in humanities and social sciences. However, sort of what do you think would economically be very important?
I think in that world, we would probably find some kind of cohabitation agreement with China in particular, as seems to be evolving in the automotive space already. Right? And I'm no expert on this, so please don't quote me, or don't send me angry emails if I miss some of the details there. But the deal that seems to be shaping up there is that rather than imposing very high tariffs, we'll actually have some local local manufacturing and also knowledge transfer along battery technologies, where the Chinese are leading globally, and bringing some of this to Europe, right? So and of course that may still not be great news for Volkswagen, and they have their own homework to do, frankly. But it's at least from an employment perspective, that could cushion some of the blow.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess also, weirdly enough, maybe the reindustrialization of the US, if that's actually pursued, might help actually European exports of
If
industrial equipment. Yeah.
exactly. If that's if it's acceptable to get these things from Europe, right? There might also be a world where yeah, just tariffs or other measures lead to European industrial equipment manufacturers not to benefit very much from that. But yeah, that's also a potential upside.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Well, and I mean, I'm conscious of your time, and so where can the listeners find you? You post very well on LinkedIn, none of the cringe. Your report on the sort of new government or like predictions about the new German government is well worth a read.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I think LinkedIn is is probably the place where I'm most active. I also occasionally post on X or on Blue Sky, but that's been that's been less of a focus for me over the past months. So yeah, LinkedIn is where and also actually lots of my colleagues at Aurora Energy Research put out lots of very interesting content from across the world, really, on energy markets. So if you're interested in that, do give us a follow or an ad.
Yeah, including a podcast.
That is true. Oh, yes, there's so much plugging here. Yes, the Energy Unplugged podcast by Aurora is something you should subscribe to if you're interested in these topics.